The dining room of L'Eclisse operated on a rhythm Jada Washington called the dance, a choreographed performance of wealth where the performers were seen and the stagehands were not. To the men in $5,000 suits, she was merely a silent gear in a golden machine, as constant and unremarkable as the crystal chandeliers that scattered light across the marble floors. At 23, Jada had perfected this art of being a shadow. She knew how to move through the hum of elite conversation without disturbing a single molecule of air, keeping her hair neatly pulled back and her uniform crisp, embodying the professional discipline her managers demanded. Tonight, the restaurant was a sea of warm golden lighting and clinking crystal, a sensory sanctuary that felt entirely safe to everyone but her. Jada carried a heavy silver serving tray with practiced grace, weaving between tables where fortunes were made and lives were ruined over appetizers. Her eyes were always down, focused on the service, yet her mind was a recording device, cataloging the subtle shifts in the room. She approached table 4, where Dante Moretti sat. He was an anchor of authority in a perfectly tailored black suit, his large, imposing frame commanding the space. Behind him stood Luca Rossi, the bodyguard whose rigid posture usually suggested a wall of granite. As Jada leaned in to set a fresh glass, she adjusted the angle of her silver tray. For a split second, the polished metal became a mirror. In that curved reflection, the world distorted, but the intent was clear. She didn't see Luca scanning the room for external threats. She saw his eyes fix on the back of Dante's neck with a cold, unreadable focus. In the silver mirror, she watched Luca's hand twitch, a microscopic movement toward a concealed blade hidden beneath his cuff. It wasn't the reach of a protector. It was the coiled tension of an assassin. The dance stopped. The clinking glass and low murmurs vanished from Jada's ears, replaced by the thundering beat of her own heart. She saw the shadow falling over the king, a betrayal hidden in the very loyalty Dante took for granted. The man society taught Dante to overlook was the only one who saw the steel before it struck. With a surge of courage that shattered her mask of invisibility, Jada gripped the edge of the tray, her eyes widening as she prepared to throw her entire life into the path of a killer. The silence of the dance vanished in a violent explosion of silver and porcelain. Jada didn't hesitate. She put every ounce of her hidden fear and sudden resolve into the throw. The heavy tray left her hand, spinning like a jagged disc through the warm, golden light before slamming into the side of Luca's head, just as his blade cleared his cuff. The sound was deafening, a harsh metallic clang followed by the rhythmic, musical destruction of expensive wine glasses as they rained down onto the marble floor. "Dante, move!" Jada's voice ripped through the elegant hum of the dining room, a raw, piercing warning that shattered her 6-month streak of invisibility. Dante Moretti reacted with the instinct of a man born into war. He lunged forward, his massive frame overturning the heavy mahogany table as he dove away from the shadow behind him. He rolled, coming up on one knee with a weapon drawn from his waistband, his luxury suit coat flaring out like wings. Luca, stunned by the impact of the tray and blinded by a spray of red wine, stumbled back, his unreadable expression finally breaking into a mask of snarling rage. The restaurant erupted into absolute pandemonium. Wealthy patrons screamed, diving under white-clothed tables, while the clatter of silverware and the frantic shouting of the waitstaff created a cacophony of terror. Amidst the swirling chaos of fleeing bodies and overturned chairs, a strange, static bubble formed between the waitress and the boss. Jada stood frozen, her chest heaving, her hands still raised in the stop gesture she had made as the tray left her fingertips. Her hair, once a symbol of perfect discipline, had begun to fray at the temples, and her wide, alert eyes were fixed on the man she had just saved. Dante looked up, his face a landscape of shock and confusion, a crack appearing in his usual mask of untouchable authority. In that heartbeat of realization, their eyes locked. Dante didn't look at her as a piece of the decor or a nameless hand anymore. He looked at her with a piercing, lethal intensity as he realized the danger he had failed to see, and the woman who had seen everything. The protector had become the assassin, and the invisible girl had become his only shield. As security teams flooded the room and guns were leveled, the only thing that felt real was the terrifying, electric connection between the king and the ghost. The smell of gunpowder and expensive spilled Merlot hung heavy in the air as Dante Moretti's security team swarmed the wreckage of the dining room. Luca Rossi had been tackled and dragged into the shadows of the kitchen, but Dante's focus remained pinned on the young woman standing amidst the broken glass. Jada felt the shift in the room's gravity. She was no longer a shadow, but the center of a lethal storm. Before she could breathe, two of Dante's men were at her sides, their grips like iron manacles on her arms. They didn't lead her out through the front. They moved her through the service corridors she knew so well, though they had never felt this cold. Within minutes, she was thrust into the back of a black SUV with tinted windows that erased the city lights. Dante sat across from her, his large frame filling the cabin. His hands clasped tightly together as he stared at her with a terrifying, silent intensity. He didn't speak until they reached the sterile, high-security confines of a private safe house. "Who do you work for?" Dante's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in Jada's chest. He paced the length of the room, his luxury suit coat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. A tray doesn't just slip. A shout doesn't just happen. Was the distraction part of the price? Did they pay the waitress to make sure the target moved into the second shooter's line? Jada sat in a high-backed chair, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she refused to let her gaze drop. There was no second shooter, Mr. Moretti. There was only the man standing behind you. The man you trusted while you were busy ignoring me. Dante stopped his pacing, leaning down until his face was inches from hers, trapping her in his personal space. 6 months, he hissed. You've been in my periphery for 6 months. Why now? Why risk your life for a man whose name you only know from a reservation book? I know more than your name, Jada countered, her voice steadying as her fear turned into a sharp, defensive edge. I know you like your wine at precisely 64 degrees. I know you never sit with your back to the door, except when Luca is there. I saved you because I saw a snake about to strike, and I'm tired of being the only person in the room who actually pays attention. Dante straightened up, the shock on his face finally giving way to a grim, sobering realization. He had spent months looking through her as if she were made of glass, never bothering to learn the name of the woman who had just cataloged every detail of his life, and used those details to save it. His life had been bought by a woman he had treated as part of the furniture, a blind spot in his own empire that had proven more loyal than his own blood. The heavy silence of the safe house was shattered by the frantic vibration of a phone on the mahogany desk. Dante snatched it up, his expression hardening into stone as he listened to the panicked report from the restaurant. The news was a physical blow. The kitchen corridor had become a kill zone, and Luca Rossi was gone. He hadn't just fled. He had dismantled the 2 guards meant to hold him with a surgical precision that left no doubt about his true capabilities. The man who had spent years as Dante's shadow had finally stepped into the dark, and in that darkness, he was the ultimate predator. Jada watched the color drain from Dante's face, her own stomach twisting into a cold knot of dread. She was no longer just a waitress who had seen too much. She was the witness who had ruined a masterpiece of betrayal. By saving the king, she had painted a target on her own chest. Luca knew her face, her shifts at the restaurant, and likely the route she took to her university library. To a man like Luca, she was the only variable that had gone wrong, a loose end that required a permanent solution. "He's out," Dante said, his voice dropping to a hollow, icy rasp. He turned to the window, but this time he pulled the heavy velvet curtains shut, sealing them in. He didn't head for the docks or the airports. He's gone to ground in the city. He knows every bolt hole, every blind spot in my security, and every person I've ever paid to keep a secret. The luxury of the suite suddenly felt like a gilded cage. Jada realized that the walls meant to keep her safe were the same ones Luca had helped design. Every camera angle, every reinforced door, and every hidden alarm was a piece of information the assassin already possessed. Luca wasn't just a threat outside the door. He was a ghost haunting the very architecture of Dante's life. Dante turned back to Jada, his eyes reflecting a mixture of guilt and a new, desperate protective instinct. He realized that by bringing her here, he might have led her into the center of the crosshairs. Luca wouldn't just come for him. He would come for the girl who had dared to break the dance. The invisible waitress and the untouchable boss were now tethered by a shared death sentence, hunted by a man who moved through the city like a shadow in the night. Dante paced the confines of the safe house like a caged lion, his phone a useless weight in his hand as he realized the traditional lines of his power had been severed. Jada watched him from the armchair, her poise returning as the initial shock of the escape faded into a cold, academic clarity. She realized that while Dante understood power, he understood nothing of the people who facilitated it. To him, the world was built by titans. To her, it was maintained by the invisible. "You're looking for Luca in the high-rent districts and the private airfields," Jada said softly, her voice cutting through his frantic thoughts. "But Luca knows how to disappear because he watched us. He watched the busboys, the couriers, and the cleaning crews. He knows that in this city, if you wear a uniform and carry a tool bag, people stop looking at your face." Dante stopped, turning to her with a look of exhausted frustration. "He was my brother, Jada. I knew his mind." "You knew what he showed you," she countered, standing up and smoothing the wrinkles in her black vest. "You see the world from the top down, Mr. Moretti. You see the board, but I see the floor. When you're sitting at a table in L'Eclisse, you think you're in a private bubble. You don't notice that the sommelier lingers a second too long when your consigliere mentions the port authorities. You don't see the way your driver, Marco, adjusts his mirror not to see the traffic, but to watch the reflection of your phone screen." Dante's eyes narrowed, the gears of his mind shifting. "Marco? He's been with the family for a decade. And for 10 years, he's been treated like a part of the car," Jada said, her tone devoid of judgment but sharp with truth. "He's been passing information to Luca for months. I've seen them in the alley behind the kitchen. Quick exchanges, no words, just the sliding of envelopes. You think your inner circle is loyal, but you've surrounded yourself with people who have spent years being treated as if they don't have ears. They hear everything, Dante. They know about the Russian shipment. They know about your father's failing health. And they know that Luca is the one who actually pays attention to them." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of Dante's crumbling reality. He looked at the woman before him, a linguistics student in a waitress uniform, and realized she was the most dangerous person he had ever met. She had spent 6 months deconstructing his empire from the periphery, not because she wanted to destroy it, but because she simply could not help but see the truth. She was offering him a masterclass in survival, teaching him that the greatest threats were never the ones who shouted, but the ones who stood in the corner, holding a tray and waiting for the music to stop. Dante sank into a leather chair, the weight of Jada's revelations pressing into his shoulders. He pulled a dossier from a hidden floor safe, his fingers tracing the name Luca Rossi. For years, he had viewed Luca as a shadow, an extension of his own will, but as Jada spoke of the secret exchanges in the alleyways, the history between the two men began to sour in his mind. Luca hadn't just been a guard. He had been a witness to a life he was never allowed to lead. The grudge was a slow-burn rot that had started decades ago. While Dante was groomed in Mediterranean villas and sent to private schools to polish the rough edges of a mob heir, Luca had been the son of a low-level soldier who died for the Moretti name. Luca had grown up in the cold, damp basements of the family's old Chicago properties. receiving Dante's hand-me-down clothes and being taught that his only purpose was to take a bullet meant for a better man. Every time Dante bought a new luxury suit or tipped a waiter $1,000 without a second thought, the resentment in Luca had deepened. He hated the effortless way Dante moved through a world of wealth that was built on the backs of men like Luca's father. To Dante, the money was water. To Luca, it was blood that had never been shared fairly. He didn't just want your seat, Dante, Jada said, her voice cutting through the heavy air. He wanted to tear down the pedestal you've been standing on since you were a child. The betrayal went deeper than mere envy. Dante's contacts within the intelligence network finally confirmed what Jada's observations hinted at. Luca had forged a secret alliance with the Valenti family, Dante's most vicious rivals. The Valentis had promised Luca what the Morettas never would, a seat at the table and a territory of his own. They had used Luca's intimate knowledge of Dante's blind spots to orchestrate a coup that would end the Moretti line once and for all. Luca wasn't just a disgruntled employee. He was a man who believed he was reclaiming a debt the world owed him. He had spent a lifetime learning how to be invisible so that when he finally struck, the blow would be fatal. As Dante looked at the invisible waitress who had derailed Valenti's master plan, he realized that he had been fighting a war he didn't even know had started, led by a brother who had spent years sharpening a knife in the dark. The heavy, tailored weight of a Glock 19 felt wrong against Jada's hip, a cold and clumsy intrusion where her order pad used to sit. Dante had insisted on the weapon, his eyes dark with a protective ferocity that bordered on desperation. He had surrounded her with his elite guards, turning the safe house into a fortress, but Jada could feel the walls closing in. Dante was trying to fight a ghost with a sledgehammer, but she knew that to catch a man like Luca, you didn't need more firepower. You needed to return to the shadows. "You can't keep me in this box, Dante," Jada said, her fingers tracing the rough texture of her discarded waitress vest. "Luca isn't looking for a girl in a safe house. He's looking for the variable that ruined his plan. If I stay here, I'm just waiting for him to find the key to the door." Dante stood by the fireplace, his silhouette massive and imposing. "He's a professional killer, Jada. Out there, you're exposed. Out there, I'm invisible," she countered, stepping into his light. "You want to send men in tactical gear to the docks and the dive bars? They'll see you coming from 3 blocks away. But a girl in a windbreaker with a transit card? I'm just part of the background noise." She had spent months listening to the Valenti family's couriers talk while she refilled their coffee at La Clese. She knew about a basement social club beneath a laundromat on 22nd Street, a place where the help went to breathe, and where men like Luca went when they needed to coordinate a coup without being seen by the cameras. Dante's power was a beacon. Her lack of it was her greatest weapon. Reluctantly, Dante handed her a small, encrypted earpiece, his hand lingering against hers for a second longer than necessary. The touch was a silent acknowledgement of the shift in their dynamic. He wasn't just her protector anymore. He was her partner in a gamble that defied every rule of his world. Jada left the gun on the mahogany table. Instead, she tied her hair back in a loose, messy knot and donned a nondescript gray hoodie. As she slipped out the back entrance and into the cool Chicago air, the invisible girl felt the familiar rhythm of the city take her back in. She wasn't an assassin or a mob boss, but as she moved toward the neon hum of the 22nd Street laundromat, she knew she was the only one who could get close enough to see the man behind the curtain. The grand crystal ballroom was a shimmering trap of gold leaf and predatory smiles, a place where the city's elite gathered to celebrate a peace that Jada knew was a lie. Beneath her elegant floor-length gown, her heart thrummed with a familiar, high-stakes rhythm. She no longer wore the waitress's apron, but she moved with the same calculated invisibility she had perfected at La Clese, her eyes scanning the room not for empty glasses, but for the subtle shift of a shadow. Dante stood at the center of the gala, a target draped in luxury, his broad shoulders anchoring the room. To the crowd, he was the untouchable king of the Moretti Empire, but Jada saw the tension in his jaw, the coiled readiness of a man who finally understood that his greatest threat was the one he couldn't see. Across the room, the Valenti family watched with hungry eyes, waiting for the ghost they had hired to finish the dance. Jada felt the shift before she saw it. A cold draft in the heated room, a microscopic break in the pattern of the waitstaff. A figure in a tuxedo moved through the periphery, his gait too precise, his focus too singular. It was Luca. He had shed his guard's uniform for the disguise of a guest, but his eyes still held that same icy, lethal focus she had captured in her silver tray months ago. She didn't run. She glided through the crowd, a ghost among ghosts, until she was directly at Dante's side. The air between them sparked with the electricity of their shared secret. As a Valenti associate approached with a hollow toast, Jada leaned in close, her lips almost brushing Dante's ear as she whispered the words that had changed both their lives. "The man behind you isn't your guard," she breathed, her voice a sharp blade of truth amidst the ballroom's hum. This time, Dante didn't flinch or dive in confusion. His hands, which had been loosely holding a champagne flute, tightened with lethal intent. He didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he caught Jada's reflection in the polished surface of a nearby ice sculpture, using her eyes as his own. The moment Luca reached for the silenced weapon hidden beneath his silk jacket, Dante spun with the force of a hurricane. He was no longer the blind king. He was a predator who had finally learned how to see. As the ballroom erupted into a second, final symphony of shattered glass and shouting, Jada stood her ground beside him, no longer a waitress, but the architect of his survival. 6 months later, the golden glow of L'Eclisse felt different, stripped of the predatory chill that had once haunted its shadows. The restaurant had been rebuilt, the marble floors polished to a mirror finish that no longer hid the stains of betrayal. At table 4, the seat of power remained the same, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Dante Moretti sat in his usual spot, his large, imposing frame relaxed for the first time in years, his broad shoulders no longer hunched against an invisible threat. Across from him sat Jada, no longer a ghost in a black vest, but a woman whose presence anchored the room. She wore a dress of deep emerald silk, a far cry from the starched white shirts of her past. Yet her eyes retained that same sharp, academic clarity. She didn't look at the menu. She looked at the room, her gaze cataloging the new security detail. Men who moved with a transparency and discipline that Luca Rossi had never possessed. "It looks different from this side of the silk," Jada said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of a crystal glass. The clinking sound was no longer a trigger for panic, but a note in a peaceful symphony. Dante reached across the table, his hand covering hers with a steady, grounding warmth. "It looks different because you're the one showing me where to look," he admitted, his voice devoid of the old, arrogant steel. "I spent a lifetime building walls, Jada. I never realized those walls were just blind spots." The restaurant hummed with the quiet conversations of the city's elite, but the dance had changed. The staff moved with a new sense of dignity, overseen by a management that finally understood that the people holding the trays were the most vital sensors in the building. Jada watched a young waiter navigate the periphery, and she saw the moment he noticed a guest's discomfort before the guest even spoke. She smiled, a small, knowing expression that Dante caught and mirrored. He was still the boss, the man whose name commanded the city, but they both knew the truth. He held the power, but she held the vision. She was the architect of this new silence, the one who understood that true safety didn't come from a gun, but from the courage to see the world as it truly was. As the wine was poured, at exactly 64 degrees, Dante raised his glass to the woman who had traded her invisibility for a seat at the table. They were the new guard, a partnership forged in shattered glass, finally moving in a rhythm that was entirely their own. 1 week into her new role, Jada sat in Dante's mahogany-paneled office, But she wasn't filing papers. She had 3 different ledgers open: security payroll, restaurant logistics, and the informal household accounts. Dante watched from his desk as she aggressively circled names in red ink. "You're firing the head of transit?" Dante asked, raising an eyebrow. "He's been with us since my father was in charge." "I'm firing him because he's a ghost," Jada replied without looking up. "He's been over-reporting fuel and maintenance for 3 years. He thinks because he's family, no one looks at the receipts. But I know the price of a gallon of diesel and the time it takes to drive from the docks to the warehouse. He's not just skimming, Dante. He's creating gaps in your schedule where he isn't accounted for. That's how Luca used to slip away." Dante leaned back, a smirk playing on his lips. "I hire men with guns to protect me, and here you are taking down a 20-year veteran with a calculator." "A gun only stops the person you see," Jada said, finally meeting his eyes. "A calculator stops the person you trust." Jada stood in the center of a sterile training room, facing 5 of Dante's newest security recruits. Large, intimidating men who looked like they were carved from granite. Dante stood by the door, arms crossed, watching the experiment. "Identify the threat," Jada commanded, her voice ringing clearly. The men scanned the room, looking at the windows, the vents, and the weapon racks. They ignored the 2 cleaning women mopping the far corner of the floor. "You're all dead," Jada said flatly. The recruits blinked in confusion. Jada signaled to the cleaning women. They reached into their mop buckets and pulled out training pistols, aiming them directly at the recruits' chests. "You looked for the soldier," Jada told them, walking through their ranks. "You never looked at the help. If you want to protect this man, you have to stop looking for the monster in the suit and start looking for the person who has the most access and the least recognition. If they can get close enough to clean your floors, they can get close enough to end your life." The house was quiet, the city lights shimmering through the rain-streaked windows. Dante found Jada in the library, surrounded by city maps and local transit schedules. He placed a glass of wine, chilled to exactly 64 degrees, on the table beside her. "You haven't slept," he noted softly. "I'm mapping the bus routes that intersect with your main transport lanes," she explained, rubbing her temples. "If someone wants to tail you without being noticed, they won't use a black SUV. They'll use a city bus. It's the perfect vantage point. High up, constant stops, and totally anonymous." Dante sat on the edge of the desk, looking at the girl who had once been just a face in the background of his favorite restaurant. "You never stop seeing the patterns, do you?" "I can't," she admitted. "For years it was how I survived. Now it's how we survive." Dante reached out, gently tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I used to think I was the most powerful man in Chicago because people feared me. I was wrong. I'm powerful because you see the things I don't." Jada smiled, the emerald of her eyes catching the lamplight. "Then let's make sure they never see us coming." The skyline of Chicago shimmered through the reinforced glass of the Moretti penthouse. But the city below was not the same one Jada had navigated as a ghost a year prior. The new guard had spent 12 months dismantling the archaic, blood-soaked machinery of the old syndicate, replacing brute force with a surgical, quiet intelligence that left the rival families paralyzed and the streets uncharacteristically calm. Dante stood on the balcony, his silhouette as imposing as ever, but the predatory edge in his posture had been replaced by a grounded, watchful peace. He turned as Jada entered the room, no longer carrying a tray or a ledger, but a tablet encrypted with the heartbeat of their new empire. She moved with the grace of a woman who owned the ground she walked on, her presence filling the room in a way that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with authority. "The Valenti estate was sold this morning," Jada said, her voice smooth and certain. "Not to a developer, but to a community trust. It's becoming a vocational center for the neighborhood kids. No more soldiers being recruited from those blocks. Dante. We've cut off their supply of desperation." Dante stepped inside, taking the tablet from her and setting it aside. He didn't look at the data. He looked at the architect of his redemption. You've done more to stabilize this city with a pen and a few strategic invisibles than my father did with 40 years of intimidation. I just changed the dance, Jada replied, a small smile playing on her lips. I populated the city with people who see everything, the street vendors, the janitors, the couriers. We don't need a war when we know exactly where the first spark is going to fly. The peace they had brokered was fragile, held together by the thread of Jada's insight and Dante's reach. But it was real. They had become a myth in the underworld, the boss who learned to listen and the queen who saw through walls. As they looked out over the glowing grid of the city, Jada leaned her head against Dante's shoulder. The invisible girl had finally built a world where she could be seen, and the man who was once blind now had his eyes wide open, watching the horizon they had built together.